I'm really happy to be here. I am Nan Franks, and I've worked a long time in this field and become pretty passionate about problem gambling in the recent past. So currently, my focus is clinical and training, and I'll just tell you a little bit about my history with problem gambling. Of course, I had worked in addiction the bulk of my professional life, and yes, my 1973 was volunteer, but I have been through professionally a lot of changes in our community, a lot of trends with regard to alcohol, substance use, and now an increase in our problem gambling stats. I think most of us know when we increase access and acceptability to any behavior, we increase the pool of people who are going to experience problems. And so we're at the cusp of that with this move to online sports gambling. And we'll talk a little bit about the trends in the development of that. And I'm hopeful that you'll all participate in the March opportunity, because a piece of, for me, of ethics is knowledge and competence. And that means for me that I have to kind of immerse myself in the worldview of someone who's experiencing this problem, especially if it's a world that I don't really live in. So take a deep breath. We're here just to kind of learn and exchange ideas. I know it's a webinar. I will hope if you have questions or thoughts, I guess you can pop it into the chat, because this is your time. And I already have an agreement with Greg that if you all, as our pilot for this, decide that you needed something different, we'll be able to hopefully do that for our next audience. So welcome. So I want you to think just for a couple of minutes as we orient to the day. Why are you here other than you just need CEUs? Have you started to get an interest in gambling? And my guess is the more you learn, the more interested you will get. You know, what are you hoping to gain from today in terms of your own understanding of professional ethics and how they permeate really every aspect of our work? And is there something you have to give as a result of this to a colleague or to someone else, or something that you want to share with us in the chat that will be good for all of us? Because we're endlessly learning. And I often think why I've enjoyed my career so much is that when we're in this space of allied health or behavioral health, there's always something new to learn and always a new skill or perspective to gain. So at least for me, it keeps me very engaged in our field. Whoops, we went a little too far. So just as our baseline, because we are talking professional ethics today, we want to think for a minute, what is the difference between what we might consider our morals, generally thought to be something that comes from a higher calling, whereas our professional ethics come from a group of our peers who have decided, looking at the scope of practice and looking at the values we hold, that these are the behaviors that are going to result in adherence to those values and positive outcomes for our clientele. So it's very different than our kind of what may be a moral stance. I find if you're in this line of work, probably your values match pretty well with the values of your profession. If they don't, you're going to be miserable. So if you find as you go along in your career that you do not align in your personal values with the values of your field, you may need to get some help or look elsewhere. We do need to recognize, I don't know that our values change so much over time, but our perspective may change over time, and how we're challenged by values may change over time. For me, and probably for many of you, depending on the population I'm working with or the client who's in front of me, different aspects of my values may be challenged. And that's why I stay rooted in my professional ethics, which include principles and rules. So there's some difference between these. So it's not so much about me. When I accept this professional credential and role, I agree to abide by the set of values, rules, and principles that are established by my professional code of ethics. So what are they? They're guidelines, there's principles, there are rules, there's different approaches to looking at ethics. It's just a reminder that my personal ethics or values may not be the same as my professional. We often see that conflict most in what I consider to be like hot button issues around children, welfare of children, politics, race, ethnicity, abortion. Those kinds of issues tend to be the ones where we see the most conflict, and you will need to have a way to make peace with that conflict that stays focused on the orientation of your clientele. So these are basic principles that are kind of seen across the board in terms of professional ethics in behavioral health, that we value autonomy. So people have a right to self-determination. We value non-malfeasance. We want to avoid doing harm. That's not good enough. We also want to promote good. I think our work should be additive, not just neutral, but at minimum, we want to do no harm. We have a principle of justice, which means we are committed to delivering fair and just, and I would say relevant behavior or relevant treatment. When we talk a little bit about non-discrimination, which is almost nothing if it's not underfilled or backfilled with cultural competence and awareness, that we're not just having equal access, we're having relevant care that addresses the needs of our clientele, our population. Fidelity, trustworthiness. So we model, and we are committed to making realistic commitments. I'm a huge one for over-promising, and then I can't possibly deliver. So I have to watch it. I want to be helpful. I'm easily interested in things. So I'll say, oh, I'll help you with that, or I'll email you that, or I'll get you that. And I have to make sure, because I'm representing fidelity, trustworthiness, that I'm able to keep those promises. Think of your clientele as well, who perhaps have experienced a lot of alienation or broken promises in their lives, or we all talk about trauma-informed care. One of the baselines of trauma-informed care is fidelity, faithfulness to commitments. When I say I'm going to be there, I'm going to be there. And then certainly veracity. So we're bringing to this a truthfulness and an honesty. So these values or principles kind of cut across all of our major codes. In social work, these are your core values. The difference I see a little bit in social work from the focus perhaps of counseling ethics or our chemical dependency professional ethics is really the emphasis on service, social justice, and a commitment, I think, that implies advocacy and a commitment to meeting the needs of our community. Now, I don't know that that's always true in practice, and that many times with a social work background, you may be engaged in primarily individual therapeutic relationships, but it's an important piece to remember. And I think as Gregory said earlier, that the School of Social Work is advocating in many ways for the community by bringing this problem gambling to you all as professionals so that you can incorporate it into your work. So these are our core values, and it's upon those core values that the behavioral definitions of our ethical code will lie. I start this presentation now with this. So to me, you are the instrument of your work. So you're the tool. All ethics, all interventions, all of your work funnels through you. We often think about the therapeutic use of self primarily in a counseling environment, but we're using ourselves therapeutically in all of our professional encounters. So you, as your instrument, need to take care of that instrument, keep it sharp, keep it primed. So as we look at where we're most likely to get into trouble with ethics, we're going to find that we're most likely going to get into trouble with ethics in areas where we're kind of challenged, or we're not fresh, or we're actually struggling. So we start with you as the basic. So the ingredients in me as my therapeutic use of self, which I bring even to a webinar, but in a webinar, I'm going to be focusing or utilizing different skills than perhaps in an individual or a group counseling environment, so that those dynamics will be different. But I need to remember that I'm bringing to the table my thoughts, my cognitions, who I am intellectually, my feelings as a person, my feelings even about the chaos that happened for me this morning, because that's how it goes when you're in a hurry, right? Your printer doesn't work. I will tell you guys, I got lost on campus. I got a police escort because I rolled down my window and told this guy, and one of the advantages of being older and having white hair is people do tend to be very nice to you if you need help. So I got police escort over here, which was a huge relief to me. But all of that comes into what we bring today. What I hope are the skills I bring to this kind of presentation are different than the skills I bring to other counseling environments or other roles that I'm in. But I'm a package deal and you are a package deal. So it includes my experience professionally and my experience personally. I add this is actually from a healer who lived in Greece, allegedly. I think he's real. I've, of course, never met him, but he talks about effective healing interventions include a combination of knowledge. So you need to know what you're doing. You need to know the nature of the dilemma that's confronting you, or you need to know the worldview, the mindset, the pain points of the people that you're dealing with. That's your knowledge. The power is having the ability to execute an intervention so that it doesn't mean much to you if I know a lot about a topic, if I'm not able to share that or make that accessible to you. And the love part is it's your best interest at heart. You as my client, it's not my best interest. I have to bring a sense of humanity to my work, because what I want is the best outcome for you. So part of what we're getting around problem gambling, most of us, is increased knowledge. And that increased knowledge has to do with the problem itself, the venue or almost subculture in which people gamble, and the additive aspects of gambling for some people that we'll talk about a little bit today, but you'll learn more about in your treatment training in March. So we're increasing that knowledge, so it makes it easier for us to enter into that worldview and then decide what the best intervention is. So the other influence is broken down, which have to do in many ways with our notion of countertransference, right? But how I view the client, Do I view them with respect? How do I view their issues? So as we move through this, part of the challenge around problem gambling is, how do you view problem gambling? Do you view it as a bad behavior? Do you view it as a moral problem? Do you view it just with total ignorance? Do you view it like you view all other addictions? So all of that cognitive orientation figures into my interactions, which are my interactions are where my ethical guidelines, ethical behaviors play out. What's my view of my role? Am I there as an educator? Am I there as an early intervention person? Am I there talking to parents? Am I here with an older woman who's in trouble with bingo? Am I here as a teacher? So what's my role? What is my goal? Is my goal increasing awareness? Is my goal eliminating problem gambling behaviors? What is my goal? And then, of course, me and everything about me, which I feel like I say over and over again, but we are called, I think, in this line of work to forever be challenging our own biases. And that can be part of the excitement of this work, is that you're going to grow and change throughout your career. And then the nature of our relationship with that clientele and how strong that relationship is, how clear that relationship is, how clean that relationship is, will all be these influences. This is kind of an overview, and I was so glad that some of this information was in the introduction, because for me at least, and kind of, you know, if you're with me in other trainings, my story around problem gambling and being interested in it really came because my husband had a gambling problem. And I knew nothing about gambling. So I came into this really quite ignorant. I mean, my parents played poker with their relatives, and my grandmother played bingo. I went to the horse races twice and, you know, bet on the cutest horse and the cutest jockey. I had been to Las Vegas, but got really bored. And I had a friend, sadly, in high school, in my church youth group, who was killed in a street crap game. But that was the end. I knew nothing else about gambling. And so I'm entered into this world where I really don't get it, nor do I get what would make someone have a problem with gambling and someone else not. One of the things I remember, and I want my clients and everyone else to remember, is this is America, right? The gambling industry is based on making astronomical profits. So we want to remember that everything they do is designed to entice the person most likely to get a problem with gambling. Makes sense? So somebody more like me, I don't know, genetics, temperament, whatever, my attention span is about that of a gnat, and I'm cheap. So I'm not their big money maker, but all of their, the gaming, the lights, the sounds, the cheap alcohol, all of those things are designed to entice and support the highest risk members of that particular population. So just keep that in mind. And as you learn more about gambling, I think part of what you'll find fascinating is almost the behavioral neuropsych part of what goes into online gambling, what goes into a slot machine. I mean, it's incredible. So don't get me going on that, because, you know, yeah, we made a lot of progress with the alcohol industry in terms of public advertising, but we've not with gambling. Just watch or think how since January 1st, the ads have changed, and how many of us have gotten offers for my first $200 is free. I will tell you guys this, and then I'll try not to go on and on, but I do get excited about it. I'm on a website and it was like older adults making side hustles, right? I'm always looking for a side hustle. And usually it's something that it's too boring for me to do. But one of the side hustles was online bingo. I'm just like, oh my gosh. So we're looking at my demographic. I'm not in that I'm in the demographic, but I'm not in the behavioral part. You're lonely, you're sitting at home, you've got computer access, and you start bingo. And before you know it, you're hooked on the bingo and you're losing money because of the neurological impact, particularly of online or gaming that includes technology. So just keep this in mind. This is just how it's changed. And I know it's too tiny to see, and I think you've got this idea. We had just seen a huge increase in the recent past, and much of the increase currently is related to online. But depending on how old you are, you know, think back. For me, growing up, if you wanted to gamble, you either had to go to a Catholic school festival, which in Cincinnati runs all summer long. It's like Catholic festival season. Or you had to go to a bookie, or you had to go in the back of some like really disgusting store, or you had to go to Vegas or Atlantic City. Now you can go downtown, get really good food for cheap, and gamble at the same time. So this is just the how this has increased, and you can just see over time. And this if you I'm sure we'll find a way to get you these resources. I'm working on doing a better job myself, but shows traditional casinos have stayed level. So in a casino environment, think just like when you think about alcohol or other drugs or other behaviors that may create process addiction, the casino environment meets a lot of people's social needs. It gives you an illusion of being social, just like perhaps hanging out in a bar does. You feel very taken care of there. The lights, the sounds, the access to food, the personal attention. But you're seeing your biggest gains so far in sports betting and gaming. So if you're not familiar with gaming particularly, there are many, many ways in the gaming world to spend money, to make money, and even to wager money. So as you look at increasing your knowledge in this area, which will help increase your competence, you know, take a look at really the metrics in the gaming world and how that may become problematic for people. I'm beginning to wonder if those of us that were raised kind of in a highly digital environment or raised with gaming are naturally kind of primed or ready to hit the online betting world. There's also been an increase in day trading. And for some day traders, the underpinnings of that really are very similar to gambling. So there's a lot to learn, and it's pretty exciting. The other thing to remember in gambling, and this is a change I think we've gotten used to with the DSM-5 around addictions, that we look more at risk factors, severity of problem than we do with someone crossing a kind of invisible line into problem gambling. So with gambling, we have the same kind of severity index that we do with other addictions. So many of us will engage in recreational gambling, take it, leave it, it doesn't matter, it's fun, it's not problematic. We have no kind of really significant negative consequences, or if we do, it's like on a one-time event. You're on a cruise and you go to their casino and you got some really like hunky looking dealer and you lose too much money, but it's not really a deal. Then we go to where we have some problems and it becomes a little bit of a problem, but it's still kind of in a manageable phase. We can still kind of alter it, similar to the way we might alter eating behaviors or drinking behaviors or spending behaviors. And then we move into higher risk and gambling disorder. And what we'll see in that shift is a deepening of the defensive structure that accompanies the gambling, a shifting or a deepening in the cognitions that impact the gambling and the cognitive distortions. And we'll see come into play much more, perhaps, the ability to track what might trigger an out of control gambling experience, this notion of chasing the win, but we'll see an increase of all of that, which is part of that dynamic that traps us in an addiction, right? It's becomes a whole part of how we view ourselves and our interactions. So we'll see that full range of issues in gambling, and accepting and understanding that full range is an important piece of our knowledge and our competence and our ability to understand where and when to target our interventions. So if you think of your stages of change or motivational interviewing, if we're off target, our interventions don't tend to work. So it calls us to have a good understanding of this. I will tell you guys, a lot of what I've learned about gambling, I've learned from my clients, and you will find the same. So as I'm really able to work with someone and understand what goes on for them around this particular behavior or problem, it has increased my understanding of this whole disorder and how best to help it. When we talk about gambling, currently we use a pathways model. Now there's some research that's adapting this, and I think we're beginning to really accept that there's more crossover. It's just a framework for thinking about gambling that can help you in your mind sort what's going on. So you'll learn more about that when you're in your treatment environment, but just a way to think about it. So we don't all come to problem gambling from the same pathway. So that's something to just remember. When we look at what are the most common ethical violations, this is what we find in the arena of social work. One would be a failure to keep a commitment to a client. So not showing up for appointments, committing to sending a report. So it falls into that fidelity or faithfulness. Conflicts of interest, which can include some levels of dual relationship. So we'll get real concrete about this. And for some of you, I know this is the basics, but I'm always going back to the basics because the basics live. So here's an example of the basics, guys. So I agreed to meet this woman client at a restaurant. You know, I never do that. It must have been a weak moment, but so I meet her at Bob Evans. Then I've already explained to her the parameters of this relationship. So she decides at the end of this conversation that she's going to pay the bill. Well, ethically, that is not okay for me. So we ended up in somewhat of a conflictual situation in the restaurant, fighting over this bill. So live and learn, right? It was enough of a social environment to create a boundary issue. Now, I won in the end, but it's a reminder to me, the basic rules are there for a reason, and they often protect us from different kinds of conflicts. Now, if I were a person who works in someone's home or works in the community rather than an office, that might not have been so problematic. But anyway, keep that. Don't get your taxes done by a client. Doesn't matter how good you think they are. Privacy and confidentiality. Confidentiality remains one of the most frequent ethical violations. Yes, people are still having sex with their clients. That on a reportable level is one of the most often reported kind of violations. The tolerating of unethical conduct of colleagues. So if we're aware of unethical conduct, we really are supposed to report it. Client records, which usually is around HIPAA, fraud, deception, or misrepresentation of your particular scope of practice or your license. So let me just check in. Is there a way for you guys to say if you're okay? No? Okay, so we're just assuming you're okay.
There is a question and answer.
There is, I could do,
There's
like
a Q&A.
a Q&A.
Yeah, so they could put it under there and then we could respond.
Oh, okay. So you guys, let me know how you're doing. This is like one of the downsides of this environment, although it's so convenient, isn't it? I mean, that you get to be at home, you don't travel, or you're in your office, you don't have to go anywhere. Okay. Because we want this to be about you. So if you've got something you want to share, or if this isn't working for you, pop it in your question and answer section.
So we have lots of folks saying they're doing okay.
Okay, good. Oh, is you're doing it? Okay, all right,
Thanks, Brad.
all right. Okay, good. So anyway, I am a person who always goes back to the basics. It's just kind of habit. I will read my code again many times, especially if somebody asks me a particular question. And one of the basics is, have you read your code? We all sign it, but you know, you might want to read it and every once in a while go back to it. In general, even if you have multiple licenses, you will go by the most conservative code and the code that defines your role. So many of you may have or will have also additional chemical dependency professional credentials. There's really no conflict in that, but where we see the most conflict in the codes is the prohibition of relationships, social relationships with clients, and how long that prohibition lasts. So that's one to take a look at. If you work in the arena of addiction, you know that many people who work professionally in addiction have personal experience with it, either their own addiction and recovery, hopefully not their own current addiction, or that of their family. So because of the impact of self-help groups and our tendency to migrate to people who we think live out our values, you may see more social crossover, and you'll have to be extra careful about that. But go back to your basics. They will give you guidelines. Uh-oh. Am I doing it? Mm-mm. Brief technical difficulty. No. Oh, okay. Try. Okay. Nope, that's not. I'll try. There we go. Whoops, we went a little too far. You know. Okay. This is where we are. Yeah, so we're going to read our code. Okay, go back. What does my code tell me to do? What does the code have to do with my situation? And I urge you to ask yourself, when you're contemplating a dilemma, and we'll talk a little bit about models of ethical decision making, but one of the considerations is this challenge or is this dilemma legal? So is it just plain legal, or is it clinical? So an example of clinical we find in the area of harm reduction. Many of us who have been in working in addiction for a long time have struggled with the notion of harm reduction, which is essentially where we intervene to reduce the harm related to the behavior. We don't necessarily insist on extinguishing the behavior. So it would be, if you, let's say, are a high-risk drinker or a drinker with a substance use disorder, and you're not interested in abstinence, we don't want you to drive. Okay, so you getting an Uber would be in part harm reduction. So we think of harm reduction most in the terms of opioid usage, where the impact of opioid usage is not just the addiction, but it's also HIV, hepatitis C, it's overdose. So we mitigate those factors, even though we're unable at many points to get you to change your behavior. So we many times will argue over something clinically, and it's not really an ethical dilemma. Or is it ethical? So it just encourages us to not make kind of knee-jerk reactions to things, but really take a look at what is this and what does this mean. One of these, and we're in the basics, are just professional standards that we really do maintain the appropriate or proper license and credential. For me, this is consumer protection. It doesn't mean that we don't have people in our professions that we think really we would not allow to babysit our dog, but they at least have to achieve that level of standard. So it's like our Better Business Bureau. And to me, if you respect your profession, you're willing to get the appropriate license. It doesn't mean that someone without it can't be as good as you are or as effective as you are. But to me, it's kind of a show of respect for the consumer. And that means it defines our scope of practice. So, do I really know enough about this to be helpful? I might, so it's kind of like when you go to a surgeon, you want to make sure they know where your appendix is, so that when they perform that surgery, they're able to do it. Now, in many ways, your skills go across all disorders, all dilemmas. In other ways, your ability, like I said, to enter that worldview or understand the nuances of what's confronting your client increases the likelihood that your interventions, your alliances will match with their needs, and you'll have more success. If it isn't something you do not be afraid to refer. Do not be afraid to consult with someone. You're doing your client a favor. And for me, it's one of the ways I learn and grow. I mean, so I have a client right now who I think might benefit from EMDR. I don't do EMDR, so I have referred her to a colleague. Now we have that professional agreement, which is also in your ethics, that, everything's above board so that we don't end up complicating her treatment, but that's a benefit to my client. So our next big category when we're in these principles is client welfare. Your client comes first. There's really very few times, I think, where you would need to violate ethics in order to support your client. What comes to mind many times for people is perhaps someone, doesn't have enough money to pay for rent, or they can't pay their fee. You really want to know what your community resources are before you step in to pay your client's rent. One of the things I urge you to think about when you come to your ethical decision making is play it out for what's the kind of worst case scenario. And so what would happen then if you can't pay their rent the next time? Or another client finds out that you paid Greg's rent, but you're not going to pay Shauna's rent. So just kind of play that out. I think we almost always can come up with a helpful, resource-oriented solution. We need respect, and respect the kind of the ownership of the problem within our client. It is not your life. End of the story. We may know what we think is better for them. We may be tempted to tell them what we think is better, but the power of action resides in your client. Your client's safety is critical. That's their emotional safety as well as their physical safety. In the client welfare, something that has come up more recently that we didn't used to hear so much about is termination of services. So inappropriate termination of services or client abandonment. So as you read through your ethics, where certainly your client comes first, even if you're feeling some professional conflict. Notification of, with your client, notification of requests for information, making sure you have permission for treatment, permission for sharing. But this inappropriate termination of services has come up a lot more. So you are to plan for termination. You are to assist in transitioning for termination. So it is not okay, for instance, to just decide not to see someone or to just close your private practice door. If you're perhaps in an internship situation, your supervisor should work with you on how you prepare your clients for the fact that you're only there for a period of time. It's one of the reasons we want you to give notice if you change jobs, is so we can prepare your client. So it's just interesting that this is something that we didn't used to see so much in the literature around ethics, but we're seeing it more now. So non-discrimination, you have to forgive my cute pictures. I'm into horses right now. This year, I'm trying to get certified in equine therapy. So every year I have some goal. This is this year's. But I want you to remember, when we say non-discriminatory, we mean accessible, so that we have not just equal access, but accessible access. People can get to it. They can get there easily. We consider that we have access built in. One of the things that I think we're coming back to, and in many ways COVID brought this to light, is do you have services in your community? Now, there may be services available, and that's okay, but what's the likelihood you're going to access service if you have to take 3 buses? So we really want to think about access. And when we think about non-discrimination, it's not just that I let you in the door, regardless of race, gender, sexual orientation, ability, disability, language, but that I am giving relevant and appropriate care. So appropriate care by level of care. So am I seeing you just because I do outpatient and I do once a week traditional outpatient? So that's what you need. So we're not going to treat everybody as a nail just because we're a hammer. And is it relevant to their world they live in? So, I think one of the best gifts we have in our work is just gracious curiosity. I'm not going to know everything. No, am I going to know all of the lingo or all of the all of the stuff. Here's an example, and we just have to, I don't know, we just have to accept stuff. So I was working with a couple, the husband is African-American, she's very Caucasian, from the east side of Cincinnati. If you're from Cincinnati, you know what I mean, very Caucasian. And we're talking about date night. And I'm listening to this debate about date night, which has a lot to do with the location of date night. And I said to this man, I'm like, I guess I'm struggling a little bit with how picky you are about where date night is. He said, because I'm a Black man with a white woman, we're careful where we go. I thought, oh my gosh, well, of course. Now, did that cross my mind? I have to say, no, it did not. But of course, I'm like, oh, I get it. Because I'm thinking, is this like some kind of control issue? No, it was a very practical issue. There's nothing wrong with asking, because our early environments in particular set a lot of our attitudes and our experiences. I'm not a gambler, so I need to ask sometimes, what does that mean? What you did what? How are you doing that? There's nothing wrong with that. Your clients would rather share than not. Now, you don't want to come off as like ignorant and incompetent. So I heard you. I have a fair amount of confidence in my work, and that confidence allows me to acknowledge that sometimes I don't know something, or sometimes I don't understand something. It does not take away from my ability to help people or their ability to see me as a helpful person. So I just want to remind us, it's not just open the door to everybody. It's like, make sure that we are doing our best to deliver services that are relevant to our clientele. Every one of our professional ethics reminds us that the impairment we experience, remember, you're the instrument of your work. The impairment you experience will play out somehow in your work. So if you need help, you need to get it. You need trusted colleagues that you can share with, and that may not be your supervisor. So look realistically for trusted colleagues that you can talk to, because I think many times just venting or discharging, whether it's someone whose situation really bothered us or a question that we've got. And the other thing is, when we're in tremendous stress in our outside lives, we can compartmentalize to a certain extent, but there'll be times when we're not able to compartmentalize. And I don't think that means you have to get help every time you feel a little bit of stress. But watch yourself, that you can recognize when it's impacting you, and support your colleagues. I know many times I find in our profession, we almost like eat our own. We wouldn't tell a client to get help to do this, and we'd have lots of compassion for them and their struggle. And when it's a colleague of ours, we can be really judgmental. And so keep this in mind. We want to support one another. I find at times this work is really emotionally exhausting. You're spending your day moving between your own point of view and your clients, yourself and them, and thinking about interventions and strategies and back and forth. So it's just remember that we can struggle, and watch for these signs of struggle. You can look to your burnout literature. You can also look to compassion fatigue, which is often hits us in a more kind of slow erosion, where we begin to really change our worldview related to the trauma, the horrificness of life that we've witnessed. You're supposed to tell the truth, guys. Okay, your records are honest. You don't say you saw somebody when you didn't see them. You don't bill for something you didn't do. That is fraud. You don't claim credit for publications that you didn't participate in. And hey, we got, what's his name right now? The big liar in politics, George Santos. Yeah, really, nothing against George. I'm sure he's got a heart of gold somewhere, and I'm not trying to criticize him. But yeah, you also, it's truth in advertising. You don't put yourself out there as someone who has done or can do things that you really haven't done. And of course, billing. You don't bill for stuff you didn't do. But you know what? You're good enough on your own. You don't need to lie about who you are. It's just don't do it. It's so much simpler in life if you just don't do it. I used to laugh sometimes when I would see people's bios, and it would be like, has presented internationally, which means they went to Montreal once, but anyway, whatever, okay? So just think, you're good enough as you are. And if you want a new skill, you can go get it. Here's a big area. Confidentiality and privacy are one of the areas most likely to be found in violation and most likely to have significant consequences. So we're going to go over this. Even with HIPAA, okay, so if you work in substance use, you know, if you're publicly funded, which would include taking Medicare or Medicaid, that you are held to higher confidentiality standards than the general behavioral health community, which falls under the federal regulation 42 CFR Part 2. In many ways, the thinking behind that should kind of color your thinking even about HIPAA. So we only release information, or it's totally confidential, unless you have an appropriate signed authorization to release that information. So you want to make sure you get that. And you know, if you are dealing in services that are billable and they're individual or group or traditional treatment, it's likely that you will have some kind of authorization built into your system. Make sure that you get that. Even and if you were in a situation where you would try to get verbal permission, which is really not great. If it was an emergency, you want to be able to document that. Part of that challenge would be if it's on the phone, do you know who you're really talking to? But we have confidentiality regs that rule us. So HIPAA, 42 CFR, all the way kind of from first phone call to discharge. So we want to keep that in mind. Now, you always can release in the case of a medical emergency. We are to release, however, only the information which is necessary to achieve that goal. So if, for instance, you know, Greg fell out right now, we'd call 911. We'd say, you know, we noticed he didn't eat or drink anything since at least we got together. We're not going to go, oh, he's a good guy, except I don't know, he might have a few issues. That is not part of the medical emergency. So in our practice, we may, if we know of medications, we may share medications if they're pertinent to the situation. If, for instance, you know that they've been using drugs, that may be pertinent to the situation, but only that minimal amount of information is to be shared. You know, we are mandated reporters for child, elder, or dependent adult abuse or neglect. And I think most of us are pretty schooled in that. And I think most of us find that in ongoing relationships where we discover these things, we're usually able to use that therapeutic relationship in order to get the person to self-disclose or agree to the disclosure. So our therapeutic relationship is rules, except in those situations where we really do believe danger is occurring for a child, an elder, a dependent adult, or neglect is going on. Now, my belief personally is that people don't want to abuse or neglect. And so hopefully we're doing them a favor by intervening, but you are a mandated reporter. And I think to myself too, you know, how would I feel? I have to live with myself if I knew you were abusing your disabled brother in your home, and then I found out he was critically injured or had died. I would feel horrible. So, and so would I assume my client. So remember that that is something that we are, that we're called to do. And so as we frame our confidentiality with our clients, we need to frame for them what will not be kept secret. Another piece of this, I think, is we can presume a level of literacy or understanding of bureaucratic documents that doesn't exist. And so I think it's important that we make sure our clients understand what they're signing and understand what the implications are. You know, many of us, when we go to a doctor's appointment, we don't even read the stuff anymore. We just, you know, just sign it. I think you want to remember that your population may be more vulnerable than you are, or less able to navigate systems than you are. I'm like, I've been, you know, I was an administrator for years. I'm like the queen of reading bureaucratic documents. You know, I just read them. I can tell you what you have to do and what your legal loopholes are. Not everybody has that skill because not everybody was forced into that. So make sure your clientele understands the nature of what will be disclosed. In Ohio, minors, I think it's 14, are able to seek care without consent and also to keep things confidential from their parents. I'd say rarely, except in a school situation, like in a private practice environment or even a clinic, the likelihood that a 14-year-old or 12-year-old is going to come forward for help independent of parents is pretty low because of transportation and access and all of that. Those of you who work in environments with youth or schools or recreational clubs or in the community may have more times that a child, an adolescent will approach you independent of their parents. So you'll be judging the nature of that contact and whether that contact requires ongoing care and how to handle that confidentiality. When I work with, which for me, it's usually 13 and up, I don't tend to work with younger kids. I do not consider that to be something in my scope of practice. Sometimes I will meet with a younger child just to assess who the best referral might be, but even though they're coming with parental permission, we have an agreement about what will be shared and what will not be shared. And that just kind of comes from the get-go. So they understand that, you know, we're going to find a way to share with their parents. And this with adolescents is often self-harm that you're concerned about, or suicidality. So get real clear about those parameters and do your best therapeutically to make that become a shared disclosure, if not a self-disclosure on the part of your client. So I think most of us are familiar with duty to warn. It's been, precedent has been set in the last like 20 years again around this, which is your judgment of, is this a situation where I think that the individual in front of me has the ability and intention of harming someone else? I include themselves, but the someone else is that we are responsible to take action to protect the intended victim. My understanding, and if I were consulting with you, I would go back to the law, because I always want to make sure, is that we would inform that individual and law enforcement. Hopefully, this does not happen. But I'd say it's probably rare, depending on the population that you work with. And again, depending on the environment you work in, what someone's going to bring to me in an office setting or bring to me at Addiction Services Council is very different than what you might encounter if you're doing community work or work in a different setting. So our, institutions provide, people know not to come to like their probation officer and go, I'm going to go home and shoot my wife, right? People know that much. So you may not see it, but don't ignore it, because depending on your environment, it may change. You also are permitted to, again, disclose minimally if a crime is committed on the premises where you are, a crime against property or person. So if a crime is happening or has happened, you are able to call law enforcement, share who the individual is. It will be assumed, if you're calling from a behavioral health or social service organization, that they are a client there. If they're not a client there, you probably can go ahead and say that, but you share the minimum amount of information necessary to take care and intervene in that crime. Those of you who work in substance use, and I don't know if this will be extended to problem gambling or not, as problem gambling becomes a part of, we view it as an addiction. The reason for the more strict confidentiality laws around addiction was to allow people to seek help without fear of incarceration or arrest or some kind of negative consequence related to them admitting their use. My guess would be, at some point, there may be situations in which gambling will move to that. In those cases, because who's going to come forward and say they have an addiction if they think they're going to be arrested on the spot for paraphernalia or drugs and all of that. So that is why with addiction in a publicly funded environment, you have to have a court order that overrides the confidentiality regs. If you work in that arena, your organization should have a template for that, or as we get, Greg, as I get more resources together for it, there's some online resources. One is the Legal Action Center that have templates you can use. And so you don't have to, quote, reinvent the wheel or worry about legalese. But, in the realm of problem gambling, as we talk about situations, we are going to run into people engaged in illegal behavior, not so much around sports, because now almost everything is legal, but we still have, so just because, for instance, just because, we have medicinal marijuana, and just because some states have legal recreational marijuana doesn't mean that the black market for marijuana has disappeared. So just because we have legal gambling does not mean that there's not a level of gambling in which illegal activity takes place. It also does not mean, so when we think of one of the things that brings people for treatment for problem gambling the most is finances. So we will see an increased association of illegal activity related to finances, whether that's embezzlement or theft or credit card fraud, all of those, because of the connection of financial destruction as a consequence of problem gambling. So it's kind of enters, for me, it's opened up a new arena of understanding things, which includes how easy it is to get loans. It includes loan sharks. It includes all of that stuff that vulnerable populations have been exposed to for years. But it's just something to keep in mind. The type of dilemmas you confront kind of changes with the population and the issue, whether we think of it as problem or pathology or dysfunction, will change with that. So its confidentiality remains important. We see these violations most often as a result of these categories. Okay, so one is trying to be helpful. So your mother calls and she says, I want to pick up Joan after her group. What time does she get finished? My saying Joan gets finished at 7:30 implies that Joan is a client. I would have to say, can't tell you anything about Joan, but our group ends at 7:30. Lawyers, other social workers can convince us that it would be helpful if we just disclosed information without a release. Oh, they'll sign that release later, or I just need a little bit of information. So before we know it, we're giving it out. Most violations are not intentional, okay? So our helpful nature many times will push us to violating confidentiality. Here's an example. This is addiction and mental illness. My client is working with a peer supporter who happens to be a friend of mine. So the peer supporter calls me. We have no release. I just happen to know this guy. It's not professional. I just happen to know Bob. Bob calls me. He's like, what's going on with Jacob? Well, I had to stop myself. We have no release of information. So it is not Bob's business that Jacob has checked into a psychiatric ward. That is Jacob's business to tell Bob. So so I had to say to Bob, who, thank God, he understands professionalism. Bob and our professional capacities, we are not in a position to discuss clients. End of the story. I did reach out to Jacob and say, Bob called. Why don't you let Bob know you're in the psych ward? But I had to stop myself. I mean, I talk to Bob all the time about social stuff. So we have to remember, in that relationship, Bob is not my friend. Bob is Jacob's peer support person, and I am Jacob's therapist. So it's just easy. Okay, expedience. It's quicker, it's easier, we're rushed, we got productivity, we got, people waiting, people calling, because it's easy, it's expedient, we do it, and we forget to dot all the I's, cross all the T's, and make sure that we have a valid release that allows us to disclose that information. We say protected health information, and almost all of it is. So, I mean, what are you going to say that isn't going to reveal somebody's name? I had a client once. I mean, we can tell stories like that, but in the day-to-day work, almost everything's protected health information. Ego, guys. It's so tempting, particularly if you're working with someone who's in the news or someone who's part of a recent crime, or because you are so thrilled with your work that you think everybody needs to know about it, that we disclose. Or we say something that lets people figure out that we know the true scoop on this situation, or we know something that we gained from a client relationship. Just watch the ego. We all think Here's my bias, and we'll let you take a break in a minute, I'm sure. You know, I'm capable of almost every sin on the planet if given the right experience. So for me to assume I'm never going to be tempted by ego, I think is an erroneous assumption. So just keep in mind, we all can go there. And another one is intimate conversations. I want to tell my partner or my friend about my work, about my day, and I go too far and I share things that I shouldn't be sharing. The other thing we want to tell you is your partner probably doesn't want to hear it anyway. Okay. All right, so you gotta hang tight for a few minutes and then we're gonna give you a break. So let's check back in, make sure you're okay. I get so excited about this topic. I feel like I get carried away, but I do love ethics.
You can tell them to ask questions in the Q&A.
Oh yeah, you can ask questions in the Q&A. Any thoughts, questions, comments, needs? I will say, if you're looking at the ethics of the gaming industry, you're looking at a totally different set of dilemmas. Ours today is in the nature of our treatment relationships. I think for many of you, this will spark a desire to advocate for ways in which we reduce the risk of problem gambling.
Everyone's saying it's still okay.
You're still
Doing great. Love your passion.
okay, good. You know, and this is about you, so we just want to make sure. Well, good. I'm glad. I love this work, and I'm so. Again, I've said this to Greg a number of times. You know, this is we are just peaking around problem gambling, and so there's so much work to be done. And if we look to other issues, unfortunately, we wait too often as a society for something to become really horrible before we do anything. And so when you think about the venue of problem gambling today and all of our access and the continuum from prevention to early intervention, all the way through to treatment, we have a lot of work to be done. And I particularly think we need to educate parents who may not be sophisticated in the online world. I have a son who's an avid gamer. And when I got into this looking at problem gambling, because I was so taken aback in my own life as a family member by how gambling operates and how devastating it can be to families, individuals, the high co-occurrence of depression and anxiety. But my son helped me understand the gaming aspect of it. And then again, when we think, I'm often interested in why this impacts some people and not others. My guess is as we get more research, we will find it's just like everything else. It's probably a combination of biochemistry, neurology, temperament, early exposure, messaging. We do see the gambling interact a lot with value around money, more around magical thinking or associations with that than we do perhaps alcohol and other drug addiction, where you have the added potentiation of the physical addictive structure of a drug. Gambling probably resembles psychological addiction more, where we see that high level of addiction when you've got that intermittent reinforcement or the early euphoria, which in gambling is an early win. But it's a kind of, as you look at it, I hope we find ways to kind of intervene at all levels. And I'm not like a prohibitionist about gambling. I'm really not. It does bother me that we sometimes don't give people a risk analysis. But anyway, I think as you get more interested, you'll see there's a lot of ways in our community structure that we can intervene on this. So one of the big areas that we're into now that we didn't used to have to worry about is the cyber world. So violations in the digital arena are subtle and complex. So social media in this case is any digital environment. So, you know, your website, your Facebook, your Instagram, your whatever else, Snapchat, your Pinterest is kind of out these days unless you're planning a party. Your LinkedIn, any digital kind of environment easily lends itself to some problems. So we've had to take a look at this ethically in the last 10 years or so, particularly in the last 5. So as you look at your, let's just take your Facebook and your Facebook, you know, some of you know, for a while, I worked on the quick response model, which was community-based, and we would go after an overdose. And I'm the queen of ethics, right? I didn't really think about whether it was ethical or not to track people down through Facebook. Later, it was brought to my attention that may not have been ethical, but they'd be like, we can't find so-and-so. I'd like go on Facebook. I'm like, because you know how people post their food? I'd be like, she's at Skyline. I mean, it's like, to me, it was like, yeah, just go online. The problem with that is, given my line of work, if my Facebook is tied to my line of work, you participating in my Facebook could disclose that you're a client. So then I had 2 different Facebook accounts. I have a professional Facebook and I have a personal Facebook. The reality is keeping those boundaries straight can be very difficult. But here was the other ethical dilemma. Do I have a right to search online for my client without my client's permission? Now, I don't know if we have a law about that, but isn't that privacy? So what I thought of as expedient, and I have to say, I probably thought I was pretty hip for being able to do that, but I can't tell you how many people I would find on Facebook. You know, you don't have any minutes left on your phone, but you can still go on Wi-Fi. Is it really ethical for me to go through your online presence and pull out personal information that I'm going to use in a professional capacity? So that is something to think about. In general, if you're going to do a background search or an internet search on a client, that should be explicit in the release of information. It's because it's an action, so I'm taking an active role in looking into who you are. It can easily set up a conflict of interest. And when you think too about the relationship being so primary, how is your client going to feel if they're your Facebook friend and you don't like their post? I mean, these are all, I kind of remember, go to the worst case scenario. If you do not want your client knowing things about you, do not put it on Facebook. I encourage all of you to think about that. And I'm probably a little conservative, and maybe part of it for me was because when I was CEO, I was more the public face of something, but when it's out there, it's out there. There's no taking it back. And I will tell you, whether it's legal or not, your employers are going to do a Facebook search and see if you had your bong out, or, you know, you were mooning somebody, or, you know, you thought we needed to know about your bikini wax. It's all going to be out there. So I urge you to be careful. I've learned via my kids to be much better with my privacy settings, but just, you know, really attend to that. It just is a range of potential conflict that you might not want to get into. It also, again, especially if your Facebook links you to your professional life, everything that goes on there and every interaction falls into the same notion of dual relationship. So I just urge you to be careful. Be careful about advertising, be careful about your responses. Even in the world of texting, which is very common in our work because so many people communicate via texting, you're obligated to make sure that if somebody else got a hold of that text, they wouldn't know. You're not disclosing anything about that individual or disclosing the nature of your relationship. Does that make sense? So it has to be very vague. It shouldn't be detailed. It shouldn't have anything to do with symptomology or that kind of stuff. So generally, if we're texting, it's to make a contact, but we don't want anything in there that if somebody else picked up that phone, they would be able to understand that they were your client, or some level of protected information would have been displayed. So it's something to be very careful about. I do use texting because especially when I did community level work, it was just an easy way. A certain demographic, particularly younger people, tend to text a lot. And so if you're going to connect with them, many times through text is easier. They don't necessarily, if you're not professional, you don't necessarily check your email all the time, but just keep that in mind. Also keep in mind that we call, particularly Facebook, we call them friends. So inherent in that is a potential dual relationship. Am I your therapist or am I your friend? It just sets up a kind of gray area that, depending on the nature of your work, and later in the morning, we'll talk about the dual relationship stuff. So the nature of your relationship will dictate in many ways the intensity of the transference and countertransference, which then tells you really how careful you need to be about a dual relationship. So in more less intense therapeutic relationships or teaching, or it's not the same risk factors as exist in more intense clinical relationships. So when we go into this, know that anything cyber is really not very private, and it all becomes a piece of your display, so to speak. So, and that becomes, to quote my age-old mentor, grist for the mill on the part of your client. So it's just something to be aware of. Okay, so anybody with a comment or a question, we're going to look at our Q&A for a minute. Or an experience you'd like to share?
Yes, we've got a question. Is addiction, gambling addiction, the same as drug addiction? So you want to repeat the question? I can pull this up on yours.
Okay, the question is gambling addiction the same as addiction?
As drug addiction.
As drug addiction. Here's my take on this, and I don't know that this is science, but it's my take. The general course of addiction and the way that our life organizes around the addiction, and our life organizes around coping with the symptoms of our addiction is probably very same. The defensive structure tends to be very similar. What I see in gambling that for me is more challenging is the depth of cognitive distortions that accompany the belief system that accompanies it, which goes beyond classic denial. So, yeah, if we get a minute, if you take a look, there's a couple of instruments you'll be introduced to in the next training. A survey of gambling situations, a survey of cognitions, helps you see what the inner world of a problem gambler is. To me, it's the cognitions are more complex and distorted in different ways than your typical drug addicted person, whose distortion tends to focus. And you know what? I'm so sorry this is being recorded, because I'm not telling you this is science. This is my take. But the distortions in drug addiction tend to focus around the use of the drug, minimization, rationalization, and you know, classic repression, denial, whatever. You see the element of euphoric recall in drug addiction. So where we you know, remember how good it was, but many times in drug addiction, you become aware that you're only using to prevent withdrawal. Okay, so your use becomes very survival oriented. In gambling, I don't see the person perceive it as survival oriented. They're chasing the next win. And the cognitions and the belief system. So the belief system that I have a lucky number, the belief system that I can track machines hit every so often. Bad math. Some people have no idea about statistics, so they think their odds are increasing. You know, you flip a coin, your odds don't, they're just, you flip a coin, you flip a coin. It's not like your coin's gonna do to hit heads just because it did tails. So there's a kind of cognitive distortion. We do see a lot of crossover between alcohol and drug addiction and problem gambling. And I can't tell you that we understand the neurology of that yet. My guess is that we will find the roots of it are the kind of, you know, that initial payoff to drug use or that initial emotional payoff to gambling is similar. We do have some research now around people seeking medication-assisted treatment for opioid use disorder and gambling. But remember, that's only because that's what the research looked at. It doesn't mean necessarily that opioid users are more likely to gamble than alcohol users. We are just beginning to look, I think, at the impact of gambling across populations. Again, I'm a little conservative. I'm like, if you know, struggled with drug addiction, I would be very careful with anything else that has a similar kind of similar impact, and that would include gambling. I don't know if that helps. I find in families of gamblers, the sense of distrust and dishonesty seems deeper than that in where I work with alcohol and drug addiction. And I think part of that is that we're able to hide the gambling many times longer than we are able perhaps to hide alcohol or drug addiction. But you know what, that's something I think we want to articulate better. So that's a long answer, but I have to tell you, I'm evolving my way through this and evolving my way through my thinking. As you get into this area, I recommend the annual Problem Gambling Network of Ohio conference, where you'll hear a lot more research presented. And there's a lot of research that's going on. I'm kind of a nerd, so I like that. But yeah, where I think we're learning more and more about differences. So yeah, long way to answer that. The other thing I'd like to say to that is, even in alcohol and drug addiction, we go addiction is addiction, which is true. But the environment in which I use or procure my substance is something we should factor into our treatment and intervention. It's the same with gambling. So if I'm primarily a casino gambler, the secondary reward of that environment may be very different than if I'm an online only gambler or a sports bettor, where we have a whole social world that takes place around sports betting. And I think it'll be recommended in your treatment, but I guess I recommend that you visit a few venues if you're not in them, so that you get a feel for what that environment is like. It's and what the appeal might be, because what the positive payoff is will interfere with my ability to make a choice in my best interest. So for instance, I'm working with an 84-year-old right now who started gambling after the death of his wife. He gambles in a casino, and that's his only social outlet. So he's going broke. But if we want to intervene on that, we're going to need to help find what additional payoff there was or secondary gain there was for him in a casino environment, or we're just going to have, a guy that sits home alone and is lonely all the time. So it's a fascinating question. And if you work in drug addiction, get into this. I mean, it's really interesting.